Hello ladies and gentlemen, Willy here. Today I want to ask you a question. Just why did 40-man raiding in World of Warcraft die? Raiding has changed formats many times over the years, from massive 40-man or 20-man endeavours in Classic to then 20 or 10 in TBC, eventually going to 10 or 25 in Wrath of the Lich King across all raids. What caused the downsizing of massive raids in our massively multiplayer online role-playing game? Why did they need a downscale? The player base was only ever going up throughout the first two expansions. Why should a constantly growing game have one of its most core and iconic diversions reduced in size? Raiding has always been one of those constant endgame goals for many players to take part in. Some want to experience the scale of being alongside so many allies, some want to be there for the atmosphere and to see the big lore character names in front of them like Ragnaros or Nefarian, and others just want to be there for those sweet epics. 40-man raiding was only ever a cornerstone of vanilla, and it's never taken part in endgame raiding from this period onwards. I hear many people point out that one of their issues with raids was just the size, the pure amount of people that were needed. These raids could go up to 40 people in total, but were by no means designed for 40 people. Back in vanilla, if you had 40 people, chances are there are about a dozen or so players who are doing roughly what they should be, another dozen sort of a mix between auto-attacking and lagging since their PC can't handle the scale of the event, and then a mix of players who are sort of semi-AFK or just sort of existing. It was a different time, as has now been evidenced by many guilds smashing through Molten Core easily. Not having enough players doesn't really come into it for me, it's more about having enough players who are actually doing something that's making the bosses go down. And nowadays with modern infrastructure and game knowledge, that's the majority of players, making many bosses sub 1 minute affairs. Whilst this is allowing many players to see raids, and it's already clear at Blizzard by this point, they appeared to be happy with the testing so far in what players were able to achieve. In subsequent raids, more difficulty and more mechanics were thrown in to the point where at Naxxramas, a comparative handful of players completed the raid. And whilst it's great adding difficulty for the top end content, if about 60 or so alleged guilds in the world are able to complete it, I think that's a little bit over the top, I would say. In the modern version of the game, we still have a similar affair with the endgame bosses on Mythic being very difficult, but as more and more guilds gear up combined with the eventual nerfs, it's usually not too bad before the start of the following tier. This didn't happen with Naxxramas. Naxxramas was what a difficult 40-man raid looked like, a modern raid where each person could be held accountable for mistakes. No longer just a case of tank keeps aggro and you win. Fail on a Nubra Khan, you get extra ads. Make a mistake on Sapphiron, you get one shot. Stand on the wrong side on a Thaddeus, well, you could wipe your entire raid. These of course were not the only issues. Having sufficiently geared players with resistance sets and enough gold to actually raid, amongst other things, were also a part of this. But for Blizzard to make raiding a challenge, having 40 people working together, having 40 moving parts with no mistakes, sounds like an absolute nightmare. I believe Blizzard wanted something different from what they learned from raiding in Classic, especially in earlier raids like Molten Core and Blackwing Lair. It's more of an exercise in organisation and actually getting the correct number of people to show up on the day, and then just simple execution on more or less all of the bosses. Honestly, it's more of a formality to receive items than an actual challenge that tests the level of players and coordination between your raid group. I believe through raids in Classic we can already see that Blizzard wanted to push the format beyond what it was shaping up to be. It very much feels like there were many developers at Blizzard hungry to prove how tightly they could tune content, but in order to tune content you really need to know how many people are facing it. I think the skill boundaries for a 40-man raid is pretty low actually. If you're factoring in that near 40 people will need to live to actually get a boss down before they do something that's going to wipe the raid, of course. Imagine having to reset a fight every time one person out of 40 makes a mistake. It would be an incredibly frustrating experience. From Nax looking over to the start of the Burning Crusade and the new raid formats, it was clear that Blizzard wanted more than just large scale from raiding. They wanted something more competitively driven, and there were certainly big changes made heading into the Burning Crusade. TBC was Blizzard's first foray into designing content more specifically aimed for a certain number of players, be it 10 in Karazhan or 25 in later raids of the expansion. With content, just as it was in vanilla, becoming much more difficult towards the end of the expansion, especially in the Sunwell, which by all accounts had some of the most tightly tuned boss fights ever to have existed. TBC was also the first time when content labelled heroic was brought in for certain dungeons, aimed at a much greater challenge for much greater rewards. And TBC heroics were hard. They required CC, knowledge of the mobs and pulls, and clean execution, and even more so towards the start of the expansion. The concept of heroic or hard mode wasn't necessarily new to TBC either, finding its roots as early as vanilla in the Karaji royalty fight, where the kill order changed the loot at the end of the fight, as well as the difficulty overall of the encounter itself. It was more of a one-off event, but in some ways it paved the way for much to come. Whilst raids became progressively more and more difficult and complicated to the point where once again very few people could manage the final tier of the expansion, Blizzard at this point once again changed their approach in Wrath of the Lich King, leading us to much more trivial heroics in dungeons and the first taste of how good high-end raiding can be. The XT Heart encounter, Freya with all keepers, Firefighter, Yogg Zero, all of course incentivized by achievements which were new, as well as mounts and titles, a format that's never really been added to since. Finally, Wrath of the Lich King had the first real heroic mode at the end of the expansion in Icecrown Citadel. So let's get back around to Classic. Could 40-man raiding have supported the ambitions Blizzard had, leading to the raid format we have today? No, not really. I can understand the appeal of something at a large scale. World PvP in South Shore vs Tara Mill was fun for a day or two. It just wears rather thin, rather fast, in my opinion. An environment where the top players can excel, giving something to look upwards to and work towards, seems a better environment for me. Even vanilla itself had the testing of a 20-man raid format on a different lockout, those being the Temple of AQ and ZG, to see how players got on with a smaller setting, which would carry on forward in a smaller scale onto TBC before eventually dividing raids into either 10 or 25-man options. Even at this point though, there were still issues with the 10 or 25-man heroic raids, leading to our modern format Mythic, which is strictly 20-man only. To draw a small tangent, does anyone remember Wildstar? The game had a line, "We aren't on Azeroth anymore." It closed a while ago, but it was really huge on launch. I'm not sure how many of you guys played it or know about it, so I'm going to keep this rather short. But that game had 40-man raiding as well as difficulty, so the two of the things together, and barely anyone cleared anything. The mechanics in the raids were not too complicated, they were just execution heavy, and the healing and DPS requirements had to be met by everybody, making it extremely challenging and tiring. It's not just one person failing constantly, it can be the guy who barely ever makes a mistake going down and it still costs the group just as much as Billy who falls over every second pull. And if there are 39 other players, you have to just hope no one puts a foot wrong in an encounter that can last up to 10 minutes. There are other reasons too, player base, a very lengthy attunement and costs, but I saw modern 40-man raiding there with the difficulty added on, and I wasn't really a fan of it. I do like raiding to be more than just a gateway to gear as well. I got into raiding seriously at the start of Cataclysm. Heroic Bastion of Twilight, Blackwing Descent on 10-man had some absolutely brutal fights, made slightly more difficult by dodgy scaling between 10 and 25. Raiding is good when it's a challenge you overcome as a group, smaller scale offering more chance for complexity in raids, and frankly being more important as a part of a raid than just someone who shows up who would otherwise never get off the bench, because there's no real downside to bringing along another warm body. 40-man raiding died, despite a growing player base, to bring a challenge that would otherwise have been very frustrating to try and support. I've no doubt we've lost the scale of the whole affair. Personally, I would trade scale for challenge in a heartbeat. I don't even need to think about it. Without the successive changes Blizzard have made, wouldn't even have the massive guilds we have today potentially. As well as the epic kill videos of old, we may have never seen the likes of Insidia, Paragon, Stars, Vodka, Method, Blood Legion and so on. I don't really expect Classic to be able to match any of these. In fact, the world first kill of Ragnaros sort of came out of nowhere. The stream was turned on and then 10 minutes later the boss was down. I mean, Molten Core isn't really rocket science, but in some ways it was still a bit more anticlimactic than many people had built it up to be. Nowadays, progression raiding on Mythic has very much become a job for certain people, mainly in Method to be honest, pulling in hours of preparation, live coverage from big names in the World of Warcraft community, making livings off streams, getting hosted by big sponsors. It's all grown so much from a time where you just got as many guys as you could and walked into a raid blind to see what you could achieve. There is undoubtedly some magic with the whole scale of bringing that many people to a raid, seeing all the spells fly off, bosses that scale all the way up to the roof, huge cavernous dungeons as settings for rooms, but Honestly, 40-man raiding died for a more competitive game, one where an individual can excel based upon their own merit and skill, one where Blizzard developers could prove how good they are at making raid designs tight encounters that offer a challenge, and oh boy, to this day they are still extremely good at doing that. It's one of the areas of the game that has never fallen short, mostly. I'm glad it did change in the future. This may have just been me, since I personally enjoyed 10-man heroic raiding a lot, as well as mythic raiding. Both styles do have their merits though, for sure. I'll admit that too. Which did you prefer? Would have you liked raiding to remain 40-man moving forwards, or some other format entirely? And let me know. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I will see you guys in the next one. If you like what you see, give the video a like and subscribe, as there's plenty more to come. As always, thank you all so much for watching. Take care. Bye.